Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating with Zimperium. I'd like to welcome everybody to latest webinar, and this is a webinar that's been creating a lot of interest around the world. Well, the webinar hasn't; the topic has. We'll see how the webinar goes. As folks are starting to get loaded in here by the magic of Zoom, I'd just like to kind of start off with the usual perfunctory comments. We'll try and keep this to about 30 minutes worth of content, if not even a little bit less. If there's any questions, please put your questions in the Q&A capabilities. We'll try to get to as many as we can. If there are no questions at the end, because we're so amazing at our presentation, then we want to go create questions. That's not the way we roll here at Zimperium. There will be an archived version of this up on the site before long. We can also make slides available to folks, and we'll talk about a couple different potential calls to action at the end in terms of directions where we're going to go. So with that, before I dive in, I'd like to introduce my partner in crime, Kern Smith. He's the director of all of our technical sales here in the Americas and very well versed in this topic that we're going to dive into with you guys. So Kern, thanks for joining me again, brother.
Thanks for having me, JT. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's good. It's always fun. We have a good time with these things. By the way, folks, one of the things you'll see, we do have, one slide at the end, or maybe two, around the product, but that's not what this is about. This is actually about, we've had a lot of folks from the news coverage of this, whether it was in Wired Magazine or Security Matters or wherever you happen to have seen it, that basically are on blog that have said, hey, I want to know a little bit more about this. So that's the intent of this. This is really more about the issue than it is about the solution component of it. We just need people to be aware of it. So we're gonna start diving in here, and what we had announced is around this unsecured cloud configurations. We're going to talk about what that means, and Kern's actually going to show it to you with a sample app as we go forward here real quick. So first things first, mobile app developers, and Kern and I have spent a lot of time talking about this. They might not like what I'm about to say, but a decent amount of mobile apps are Legos. The developers will go and they're producing apps, but with combinations of open source and SDKs and libraries. If they need access to something, for instance, they might just go on the internet, find that Lego, put it in, and be off to the races. Well, one of the things that they're doing now is every one of those mobile apps needs information, right? And you can store information in the app itself, or you can store information off the app and access it, right? And one of the main things that is picking up a lot of momentum is basically using cloud storage for that remote piece. So actually using cloud, and why are they doing it, right? Well, the first part is, and anybody that's been anywhere near the dev world knows this, it's all about acceleration, all about how many features can you get out, et cetera. So using cloud storage is faster and reduces complexity, right? And what it's able to do, the storage piece, though, can be complex, right? And so they are moving to cloud storage for a lot of the benefits that you see there. And I don't necessarily need to read all of them, but you can see why folks are moving to cloud-based storage. So cloud-based storage is a great idea, right? We're going to talk about some of the specifics. And there's even great guidelines that come from all the cloud storage providers. But oftentimes, as a part of the development process or as a part of the speed to market, there's some things that occur, right? So what's the problem? Well, I mentioned, here's the good. All of the providers, whether it's Azure, AWS, Oracle, Google Cloud, Firebase, they all have recommendations and security guidelines that they're actually very good about how do you configure things, et cetera. The bad, a lot of developers have a tendency to either overlook it or accidentally make some changes, maybe during the dev process, and not undo it exactly, right? The ugly, anybody who has access to that URL can actually access all the data quite often, right? And a simple analysis of that app can actually get the URL. So Kern, Any thoughts about this? Any additional commentary besides what's on the screen right now in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly of mobile app developers using cloud?
Yeah, no, I think it's all the key points that you said, JT. I mean, ultimately the challenge is that it's that balance between security and productivity and being able to get these apps out the door and the timelines that developers are faced with sprints and also all the moving parts that go on both within the app but also behind the scenes. And that's just what we're seeing is that a continuous approach of taking a look at this stuff is really critical because this stuff can flip on a dime, basically. What exists at this point in time may fundamentally change 24 hours later. So it's really about staying on top of this continued ever evolving landscape with mobile app development and all the back end components that are critical for the functionality of that app.
No, I agree 100%. And can you comment a little bit about, even though this specific issue is really around a development configuration error,
Mhm.
that last bullet point I think is important from the standpoint of one of the things that people are starting to really come to grips with is, and this will sound like a BFO, blinding flash of the obvious, multiple or mobile apps are different than traditional apps. Traditional
Right.
apps, all of the processing power, all of the IP, everything is behind a firewall.
Right.
Let's say with a web app, and then it's a dumb browser that comes to it. In mobile, you produce this app and you put it out in the public app store that anybody can have access to.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where you get into just the fundamental difference in mobile applications versus traditional web apps, et cetera, right? So while there is some overlap in that mobile applications do typically access a backend, which is really what we're talking about here with cloud storage, et cetera, which also incidentally has moved out of most customers' control and now moves to a third-party cloud infrastructure. So there's a whole host of things that go with that. But with mobile applications, once they're put out in the wild, these are great data points that attackers will start reverse engineering. They'll start seeing what is it that this app is capable of. What are the API calls that's making? What are there any API keys? Are there any type of cloud secrets or any type of endpoints that the app is accessing, along with a whole host of other things? So, given that, giving them what they're looking for is what is it that's contained within the app that they can discern from both static and also dynamic runtime analysis to start reversing the app and understand, okay, what are the interconnectivities that it has with backends and what are the weak points that they can start leveraging. We've seen this time and time again where the mobile app is really the starting point for most third parties when they're starting to profile an organization to see where can they hit it, because they know for the most part most organizations don't have much visibility into somebody trying to do that type of analysis, either statically or dynamically, to uncover any potential weaknesses or vulnerabilities.
Yeah, you're completely right. I mean, and obviously, what we're looking to do here is we're looking to discover and quash issues as quickly as humanly possible, right? And starting in the dev side of the world, and then ultimately going out to the runtime side. So, um, we talk, and this just happened to be a few examples, right? So, what did we discover, right? What we just got finished talking about is the good, the bad, and the ugly of mobile apps using cloud storage, right? But in this particular case, we're talking about mobile apps using unsecured cloud storage. So what did we find specifically, right? The Z Labs team, Zimperium Z Labs research team, is the best mobile security threat research team on the planet. I can say that I'm not part of it, so I can easily say that, but it's backed up by everything from patents to discoveries to disclosures to et cetera. This is what they found. What they found was literally thousands of mobile apps that access both on iOS and Android. So this is not a platform independent, because to Kern's point, this is an infrastructure backend piece, right? So iOS, Android apps, literally thousands of them. You can look at our blog and get the real details and et cetera. But the punchline is 14% of the iOS and Android apps, there's a percentage difference literally between the two, like a fraction of a percent. 14% of the apps that use cloud storage had this issue upon our investigation. So that is a huge number. We're going to talk about what the impacts are behind all that, but we think a lot of times it helps to actually have a picture. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to pass it on to Kern, who's actually going to show you with this sample app what this actually looks like. So Kern?
All right, let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll see what happens. So I do want to, again, kind of clarify, we're not showing live data for any third-party apps. This is actually a sample app that our team developed just to demonstrate as a representative sample of some of the things that we saw with these unsecured cloud storages. So in this instance, we have an app that's reaching out to a cloud bucket. And what we see is because of the insecure access, anyone from a public endpoint can go ahead and access all of the type of data that's disclosed here. So say, for example, if I want to go ahead and get the stock options list, I can easily hit it, and now I've got it downloaded onto my computer and fully access that. And we can see, what Joe, Jim, Don, et cetera have. But to JT's point of showing the picture, it's basically everything that's on this bucket that is insecure. And what we mean by insecure is it may not require an additional level of authentication. There's not a level of encryption. Basically, anybody can access this data from anywhere. And really what we're trying to do is help customers identify where those items are, because there are perfectly legitimate reasons in some cases to have publicly accessible information. But for the most part, the challenge is understanding, okay, what is out there that the app is accessing, and then being able to make appropriate judgments at that point. But this is kind of a demonstration of what it is that we're talking about at this point. So JT, I'll hand it back to you.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. Okay, so a little bit more detail. How big is this problem? Well, I mentioned the fact that we literally found thousands of apps with this issue. And I'll show you in the next chart kind of a spread by category. But literally, there wasn't really a category from Google Play or a category from the Apple App Store that we didn't find at least a few of these apps, right? And you kind of see the Fortune 500 and medical, social, et cetera. I'll kind of dive into this. And there's three, arguably four, but we wrapped them into three when we go through some examples here in a minute. It's kind of like, who cares, right? Well, the who cares, as Kern was just showing you, is how easy it can be. We saw a whole bunch of examples of exposing PII, personal information, including medical information. We're going to show you some examples here or talk about them. Fraud, enabling fraud, and then exposing IP and systems. And so we're going to talk about some of these examples real quick, and then we'll talk a little bit about, well, what do we do about this? Because I think to Kern's point, and it's a main theme that I think people need to understand, this is fluid, right? This is, when it comes to mobile app development, one version of my product might have something different than the next version. My Android version might be different than my iOS version. And frankly, my iOS tablet version might be different than my iOS phone version when it comes to different configurations. So we need an ability to constantly kind of stay on top of this, but in a way that doesn't become a huge burden on its own, right? So we'll talk about that in a second. So here are some of the impacted app categories of the 20,000 some odd apps that we actually kind of articulate on our blog that we discovered. And for me, some of the things that, what are the big takeaways? Because I have a lot of pretty colors, right? For me, what are the big takeaways? Well, the first one is there's a lot of pretty colors. It's, as I was saying, it's literally covering almost every category that you can come up with. So that's kind of takeaway one for me. Takeaway two for me is the predominance of business apps. You might ask, what's a business app? Well, if you actually kind of look at the Google Play, for instance, as an example, and for those folks that don't know it, we work very closely with Google. We actually vet every app before it gets put into the Play Store. So we're part of the App Alliance that Google has. So we're very close on that side. But examples of business apps, some of them might be things like, like a tax app and stuff, but most of them are actual productivity apps. They're things like O365 and those sorts of things. I'm not saying O365 has this issue. I'm giving you an example that it's a productivity app, and tools are somewhat similar. So for me, how big the business slice was a main component, in addition to the fact that there's all these other pretty colors. Kern, what is any particular takeaways that you have from this chart?
just it's not an isolated issue by use case of the app. This is something that is common across the board, regardless of the sector that you're talking about. And I think just speaks to the level of visibility that you know folks need to consider as they're implementing programs into their SDLC, that this has to be a dynamic form and function. And regardless of the use of the app, be it a high priority app, a very public facing app, or something that's relatively benign, it's just part of security good practices to understand, okay, what is it that these apps are accessing? What is the type of data that is being interacted with it? Because it's law of unintended consequences that takes place after that if you don't have that type of visibility. So it's just, this is a broader conversation rather than something that's specific to a specific industry or vertical at this point.
No, I totally agree. By the way, are my slides in the right place, Kern, or?
Oh, I think you need to switch them.
Okay.
JT.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I couldn't tell. It looked weird to me. There we go. That way everybody doesn't have to be looking at the next slide, right? So let's come back to the three categories real quick, the three big buckets of what we found. The first one is exposing PII. Again, we had a huge chunk of apps that were exposing variations of PII. What are some of the examples? Well, you can see we had multiple apps that were medical apps, literally exposing patient records, test results, legal agreements, everything along those lines. Clearly a huge issue, right? Nobody wants that stuff out there. Social media apps, literally information about people's locations and their photos and all the rest of kind of fun stuff. Again, I'm not going to read each one. The Fortune 500 mobile wallet should actually be down in the next section, which is the fraud section. But you can see some of these other examples. The fitness app, right? Including potentially being able to reverse the app, figure out location of the people that are using it, all the rest of that kind of stuff clearly you just would not want out there, right? On the fraud part, which I was mentioning with the wallet further up, there's some other examples where literally, let's say the online retailer, major online retailer, they would have people send in blank checks that would actually be part of the process to set up the accounts and be able to transfer funds and et cetera. The complete blank checks were exposed with all the routing numbers and checking account numbers and everything. Obviously would be able to facilitate identity theft, for instance. The transportation app, the whole payment system was available. Kern was talking about, the fact that this is an access to the back end. Well, a lot of times this is the stepping stone to the rest of the infrastructure, which actually gets to that third category of this actually puts IP, a lot of examples we saw were putting IP or systems at risk, providing information into server infrastructure.
Hey, JT, do you have your screen on, your sharing on pause? I think we're still seeing the app category slide.
Oh, what's happening there?
There we go. If you swap your display again.
Interesting. We're having a little technical difficulty today. This doesn't happen very often.
There we go.
There we go. So you see they're putting IP or systems at risk. Is that right, Kurt?
Yeah, that is correct.
Perfect. So, Kern, what about some of these things here? I mean, people get the idea of that there's fraud available or that there's information that can be leaked that can enable fraud or could be a PII leak around medical records and things on those lines.
Yeah.
When it comes to the IP and the system side, I mean, one of the first things that I get from this is that if you don't have a financial app that you're producing, or if you don't have a retail app you're producing or a medical app, you might be like, well, I don't need to worry about this. What are some of the ones that kind of pop out at you here in terms of some of the risks we found?
Well, it's not just about financial data. It's about any data that is being processed by the app or being sent to a back end. Because as we've seen in the news, it's not just about fraud, right? Fraud is a huge thing, and we know that. We've seen a bank, for example, get taken for $10 million because of a fraud campaign orchestrated off of their mobile application. But when you look at the type of data that's out there that could impact a company from either a reputation standpoint with their user data potentially exposed out in there, or even from an operations standpoint with, hey, a news organization working on different stories, and this could allow somebody to get a scoop on things or kind of change the narrative. There's legitimate business impact that could happen based off the exposures that really get uncovered by somebody doing a combination of static and dynamic analysis of these applications. So it's being able to understand what that landscape looks like for an organization so that you can put in some additional security checks to reduce that type of exposure, right? Based on some authentication, some basic security things, or nothing really onerous, but also having the ability to allow the app to kind of defend itself against some of this type of analysis that a third party may orchestrate with ill intentions. So not just static hardening, but also dynamic checks to make sure that, hey, somebody's not trying to orchestrate a fraud campaign using these vulnerabilities on a bunch of emulator devices that are spoofing users' device IDs and location that could otherwise circumvent fraud analysis, unless you have an understanding of what's the environment that app is working in. So it's really a conversation. We're starting with, let's understand during the development cycle of where the risks are at. But when you kind of pull on that thread, you now see, hey, look, this is really about the larger SDLC of the app, not just during the development cycle, but also once it gets out in the wild and at runtime, being able to make it harder for attackers to reverse, but also giving the app the understanding of the environment existence so it can adjudicate some of these threats and risks to reduce that overall risk posture. So it's really a programmatic view rather than a point solution.
Right, exactly. And so we mentioned, folks, that this is not a product pitch, but what we're going to do is I'm going to pass it back over to Kern here in a quick second, because he showed you with the sample app, here's what it looks like to have unsecured cloud storage. To Kern's point, this is an ongoing iterative process. And we fundamentally believe here at Zimperium that you need to protect your app from development out to runtime. This whole conversation is really around, how do I know that we actually haven't accidentally configured our cloud storage incorrectly, as an example? That's building compliant. Then there's building secure, which is obfuscation. And then there's running secure, which is that real-time environment once it's out there on your end user devices. How do I know it's not being attacked? So specifically around Zscan, I'm going to have Kern take over and actually show the concept of how we actually have the technology to assess these apps. And it was actually the technology that was used to discover this issue, but how we can actually, as a part of your development cycle, based on the configuration policies that security works on and says this is acceptable and this is not, issues will be flagged automatically in a continuous fashion. A ticket can be generated for the developer to close it. Once they close it, then you can obfuscate the code and put it out in runtime. So Kern, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it back to you. Can you show Zscan around the lines of what we're talking about here?
Absolutely. So I'll just kind of highlight a few things without going too deep onto it. Again, just to highlight what we're talking about with the leaky buckets. But within our Zscan console, what we would surface here is a couple of things, right? And it's not just about leaky buckets. It's a larger conversation with over 100 plus, 200 plus policy items that we would trigger on or flag on based off of whatever policy said we wanted. But in this instance, I have this demo app that has a couple of leaky buckets in there. So what I want to do is dig into it and understand, what are those leaky bucket instances? So in this case, I can see, hey, there's the stock option list item that we visited earlier, and start kind of adjudicating things and maybe taking actions, accept, unaccept, create tickets, those type of things. But if I want to look at a larger report around everything and kind of consume this as a security admin, we also have the same items available in PDF format. So in this case, I've got all the leaky bucket instances listed and going forward from there. But to JT's point, it's not just about that one-time assessment. It's about what's happened over the entire life cycle of the app and what has changed over that time period. So you can see in one instance of the app, we didn't have a leaky bucket, but in subsequent ones we did. So being able to compare those items and really understand how that landscape is continuing to evolve as you're going through the dev cycles and integrating it with your build servers, being able to feed this data back into whatever your development, your CI/CD platforms are, or such as Jira or Azure DevOps, et cetera, so that you can automate these tasks while the developers are in their sprint, really becomes essential to driving that value and really shortening or shortening the time to market during that development cycle, and making security analysis, making this type of regulatory analysis just part of that development cycle as a natural reflex, rather than a gate before you're about to deploy or go GA at that point. And to JT's point, having the ability to run secure and be able to authenticate as well.
So Kern, let me ask you a question. I mean, for a lot of folks, I started off by saying that these mobile apps are basically Legos, right? People getting an SDK from here, and they're getting a library from there, and they're putting it all together. Or it might be outsourced development, right? You send it to an outsourced. So for instance, we saw multiple apps that had the same issue, that when we actually went back, we found out it was one developer, right?
Yeah.
That was behind multiple, but somebody might look at this and go, okay, so you guys discovered this one leaky, so we can go in and say, okay, that's bad. We should go look at that. I would imagine it'd almost feel overwhelming for somebody to think about all the different possible security and privacy issues, and to know what's good and what's bad. How do we help people, whether it's OWASP or whatever, how do we help people kind of like, as they start this process, crawl, walk, run, what are best practices and what's the maturity approach to this whole thing?
Yeah, so great question. So I think the first thing is gain visibility. It is the first step to everything, right? And then just kind of working down through the severity levels of different items based off of our own experience. And this is where our team can kind of help guide that conversation, but also mapping it up to common compliance items like CWE, GDPR questions, OWASP, top 10, et cetera, so that you can get a better understanding of where the mapping is and what the actual potential impact is. But the biggest thing is also integrating this within the entire SDLC, right? So that this just becomes a natural reflex or a natural action as part of the development cycle, and isn't an unnatural action or an unnatural gate that's a one-time event that happens periodically. And I think that's where we've seen a huge amount of success, because initially it's about a survey of the app and understanding where the items are at and kind of getting everybody familiar with it. And then as you're going through the iterative process of reducing that exposure, ideally, candidly, we scan an app after we get through maturity model, there's not going to be a bunch of findings that gets generated, because we've gotten ahead of this stuff and integrated as part of that development lifecycle.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So people are, kind of looking at this, this specific one issue, this leaky bucket issue, is just one of many, right? And a lot of the folks that are doing this, if you have a process where you're doing manual pen testing for regulatory reasons or anything on those lines, then you would like to have a continuous solution like this, not just a one at a time, one particular version. So that enables you that whole thing. If you're using outsourced development, as I mentioned, this could be a reality check in terms of what's going on, that kind of thing. So we're going to stop, and we're going to just, if you can just continue to leave that up if you want, Kern, or we can have people look at us as we wrap up. We're going to go to questions. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. There's two recommendations that I would make if you want to continue to know more about this. One is that we have a free consultation for if you wonder, because one of the things we found is that security folks might not even know if their mobile apps are using cloud storage, for instance, right? So if you're wondering whether your apps might have this issue, we actually will do a free consultation and actually sit down with you, talk about which apps we're talking about, and then basically create a report and an analysis similar to what Kerm is just showing there. So that's one thing. If you're thinking about the leaky app stuff specifically, we can actually do a free consultation for you and run you through that part. The other thing is in April, I think it's April 24th, something. Well, it isn't up on our site yet, but it will be very quickly. Just like we're doing this on the front end part, this webinar talking about the issues from a development side of the world. In April, we're actually doing a webinar on, as Kern has been referencing repeatedly, the runtime environment. Okay, so now we produce this app and we put it out there. How can you defend your app against attacks against that app? Kern mentioned the emulators. There's also template-based malware like BlackRock and BankBot. How can you defend your app when it's in runtime is what we're going to do in April. So Kern, I see that there aren't any questions. Probably the only question in there is why can't JT put the slides in the right, format? But that question has been passed. So any last thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I just think what we found consistently is that it's not a one-time activity. Any of this type of stuff, it's a process essentially, and that's where in our conversations with customers, especially ones that have adopted, where they found the most value is where this just becomes inherent in their process of the app life cycle. And there's a huge amount of value that gets extracted from that for them, just having this as something that's integrated into the entire process and seamless versus just a one-time activity at this point.
Yeah, completely agree. Well, Kern, thank you very much, brother, once again. I hope you have a great rest of the day, even though I know you and I will be talking 50 times. I hope everybody else has a great day as well. Thank you very much. Take care.
All right. Take care, everybody.